I feel pretty tired today, and I don't think I even really feel like making a video, but I don't have much else to do. There's other stuff I could do. I noticed I wrote quite a bit, and if I do one more video, I might be able to catch up on it, because at a certain point in the next couple of days, I won't want to make videos because I want to catch up on all the processing and just go on my trip. And then who knows what I will be doing in terms of videos then. I finished off my big bag of Costco rice today. So technically I have no more dinner food for the next 5 days. So I'm not sure what I'll do. Maybe go out for dinner some of the nights, or just eat whatever day by day. Not very interesting. I was thinking about the rat park study, and I don't know all the details, but from what I recall, they did a study where they made this magical wonderland for rats, and then this other land for rats where it was overcrowded and didn't have any running wheels, didn't have all the things that rats need. And the other one, it was lots of space, not overcrowded with rats, had nice food. And when the rats were living in the area that was overcrowded and they didn't like, they chose to have a hit of some kind of narcotic. Whereas when they were in the big open area and everything was lovely and perfectly designed for them, they never went for the drugs, they just ate the food. Whereas in the other undesirable conditions, they took the hit of the drug and didn't eat food. Something like that. And I think it'd be interesting to design a study called Mad Park, where it's like this beautiful island and it's everything a person could want or desire, and take a bunch of people that are supposedly mentally ill and put them in this beautiful space for humans where they don't have to worry about anything and there's no stress, and see if they get better. Just a thought. And there's another very classic study. I can't remember what university they did it at, but they made some students be prisoners just for pretend. They set up a jail. I think it was maybe like a fake jail, but it looked like jail. Prison. And some of the students were assigned to play the role of prisoners, and some were assigned to play the role of prison guard. And they were stuck in this situation for a certain period of time. And after a while, they actually started playing those roles for real. The students dressed as guards actually started being rude to the prisoners, and the prisoners started acting like prisoners. And what I was thinking with that one is how when we go into the clinical eye of psychiatrists, either in the hospital or to their office, we begin to play the role of mental patient, even if in our daily lives we're not really that identified with it. So by putting ourselves more and more in the clinical eye, we actually morph into playing that role more so, and actually posturing it and gesturing it and talking in that way. And I'm not saying that can be completely avoided, but in my recent crisis, being able to avoid the medical eye, the clinical eye, I was able to avoid talking about the things I was experiencing to a doctor. So it might be one thing to talk about the things I experienced to myself or to a friend later on, or even a clinician later on, maybe. But it's another to have to talk about it when it's actually happening to a professional like that, because then it gets warped into the perception of mental illness. And by avoiding that, I was able to avoid having that measured out. So what I'm trying to say is, there's a lot of talk about your mental illness and all that, but I almost feel like if some of us are able to get strong enough to go through crisis by ourselves, and I'm not recommending this, I'm just saying that I was able to, it goes sort of against the whole, oh, go for help and talk about it and all that. But it avoids me putting myself in the position where I have to play that role. And last time when I went to the psych ward, I had to play that role, and I was put on a medication that made me enact and play that role even better, which was to my detriment, because I was terrified and put on a treatment that made me worse, and then that justifies me looking more and more like a mental patient, which makes it harder to get out of the situation and recover. And then the recovery is recovering from that, from being under the lens of a pathologizing I. So what I've learned is just lay down, surrender, and go through it. Don't talk about it. I was around my family. I didn't tell them that I was in absolute hell for 2 days, which seemed like longer. They brought me something to drink, and I just rolled over and went back to sleep. They didn't have to know what I was going through. Now, that takes practice, and that takes time to understand how to go about that. But once I got to a point where I could do the thing they do to me in the psych ward, but by myself, now I can just do it by myself, and then I don't have to go talk about it, which is helpful, because sometimes to get in the psych ward, you have to really share a lot of stuff, and then you have to share stuff about the stuff, and then you have to get mad that they're not listening to the stuff you're saying, and then that justifies getting in. So it amplifies it even more, and then that's noted, and then all of that justifies even further harsher treatment. Whereas if I didn't have to go through that amplifying process in order to get help, then maybe it's just not as big, and I can go through it myself. And again, I'm not recommending this unless it's very, very carefully planned, and it takes time to know what works and what doesn't work, and how to keep oneself safe. And I have that zap strap where I can fasten myself. I know where to fasten myself when I'm at home, and when I was with my family, I looked for a place that I could fasten myself if I needed to. I just looked around and I saw, oh, I can just fasten myself to that doorknob, and I'm not going to be going anywhere if I get frightened to the point where my body and my mind are incongruent in that way. So what I'm trying to say is, when we encounter the role of psychiatrist, we play the role of that which we're supposed to play in that situation. And even if we try to not play that role, that could even be construed as a symptom of our illness, like a personality disorder. If one time we go in and we're upset about something, and the next time we go in and we feel fine and we feel like ourselves, but that ourself might actually be interpreted as something wrong. So there's no escaping it, really, unless we can get to the point where we can go through a severe inner storm and just take it, just surrender to it, and just lay down and just don't move and just wait it out, no matter what happens. Because if we walk around and start talking about stuff, then we get labeled with more stuff, because it is temporary, and it can be a very short duration, but it can be dragged out longer if we're in the eye of somebody who has the power to drag it out by continually talking to us about it and then putting us on this med and then that med and then spiral, and then the med makes it worse and the med makes it go on forever. So one of the ways to help with this whole recovery journey, as it's called, is to not just recover, but to also along the way really pay attention to ways that we can help ourselves get to the point where we don't need that type of crisis intervention, because a lot of times it can make it worse before it makes it better. And if we find something that works in that crisis, in particular some kind of PTSD, flashback, psychosis, or dissociation, then we can perhaps help ourselves through it. And that takes a lot of strength. So they say, oh, it takes strength to get help. But if we get help, we get help, we get help to the point where now we know how to help ourselves, we're strong enough to help ourselves. And then we don't have to go through that extra stuff. And then at a certain point, it's like, how much of a mental illness do we really have if, 2 days a year we have to take PRNs to go through some kind of inner storm? And imagine if we started to play the role of mystic or something else. Maybe peer is a language, and not peers based on mental illness, but just having access to this trans dimension that we all share. It's a language we all share. And it's the language of vision. And we all have very similar eyes. We can all see. It's all the same light. So if we're looking without distortion, we should be able to give voice to this particular language of light. And how you speak is the role you play. So if we're continually speaking as mental patients, we're going to be playing the role of mental patient. But if we speak in terms of what else could it be, if we give voice to that, then maybe we're more like philosophers. We can be like peer philosophers of some kind, sharing and wondering about the wisdom of our experiences and perceptions, and not holding on to them too tightly, just moving on. Whereas the stigma story, the mental illness story, they want us to hold on to that so tight that we never forget, and we always believe it. And I'm not saying disidentify from that completely. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying that we can make space for other perceptions. And I feel it's possible, in my experience, that over the years, over the 6 years, I've gotten better at being able to give voice to some of this, because in the very beginning it was mostly nonsensical. And that's because the language of the ego is still mixed in with the language of perception and the language of the past. And that soundscape still comes up in consciousness sometimes. And then I just wait for the energy of that to pass. We can speak about philosophies of crazy. We need to share our philosophies from our perspective and how we see it, not just our story framed on how we've been told to see it. And I was thinking about this whole light as nutrition for the brain, and it also, in a way, becomes our driver. It becomes what drives us. The light in our perceptions are what drive us and lead to gestures and actions. Seeing leads to the gesture. And this is, instead of having sound, old soundscapes as our driver. So we need to have this as our second language. We may still need to speak to clinicians how they want us to speak to them, but we can still develop this capacity to think and speak about ourselves and the world the way that we would like to. And I feel like we need to have more conversations with each other about the mistreatment that happens in the inpatient unit. we could almost have a more harm than good speaker series. And we could start talking with each other over Zoom. It's a pretty good app. And I feel like we're actualizing that we're sensitive to more than just ourselves. And we're super sensitive, and that can drive us crazy. And that's actually what builds up the allostatic load faster. The stress, the accumulation of stress. I've shared my story in the past with different groups, and one of the things I talk about is grieving the loss of one's former self, and it took me several months to do that. And then I got involved with lots of different stuff and went on the journey of rediscovery and recreating myself. I like to say rediscovery and recreation as opposed to recovery, because recovery sounds like recovering over the problem and then pretending everything's okay and then going on. That's something that medication does. It's good for recovery. But anyway, I feel like by talking about ourselves and thinking about ourselves in different ways, it will help us grieve the loss of our former selves more easily. I was able to grieve the loss of my former self, and luckily I was immersed in a community and having fun, so I didn't hold on to that as much. But I feel a lot of people never finish grieving the loss of their former self because of how they really buy into the stigma story, and maybe their body changes from taking medication and they have really bad side effects. So how can one really complete the grieving process when one is suffering so much? And luckily I didn't have a lot of side effects. I had quite a bit of weight gain, which I slowly lost over time. But again, it was the relationships in the community that was so much fun that I didn't miss my old life. But what I'm trying to say is, when we start to reframe how we think and look at ourselves, maybe we can grieve the loss of our former self a little bit less, because we can see that there's this new self coming into being, and believing that stigma story is preventing that new self from coming into being, because if we're so focused on that, we're not going to have space for the new perceptions to arise in consciousness and move us forward. And a lot of people are isolated, so then again, it's difficult to grieve the loss of one's former self. And we're never really told that there is an extreme period of grief, and a lot of that grief is due to what is piled on us through the process and through being indoctrinated into this whole paradigm. But as we can expand our dialogue with ourselves, that paradigm, it takes up a smaller percentage in our consciousness. I feel more of us have to be peer perspectivists. So even if we're not peer support workers or peer specialists or peer coordinators or any other kind of peer, we can still be perspectivists. We can still share a perspective. We can still stand up and speak up about things that we see, that even small things that need to be changed. And if more and more of us say these things, then it will change things over time, because the system doesn't even necessarily listen to peer support workers and collaborate with them. So we need more of these memes. We need more people sharing these things in order to have that soundscape out there. We need a soundscape of peers saying what they see. And not only from the perspective of being mad at the system, but also to try to help the system, so the system can help people better. And I don't even think it needs to help people that much better. Just get rid of some of the things that make things worse and don't help. The paternalism, the the rude treatment, the dirty looks, the fact that so much of it isn't trauma informed. And I listened to another talk by Ricardo Semler, and he said, I don't know where I'm going in his management style. He said they don't really have plans beyond 6 months. And he said, fit this into how you see the world and do what you think you need to do in a way you'd like to do it. And that's sort of how he manages people. And I was thinking about that in terms of my trip. I'm sort of doing what I think I need to do in the way I want to do it. And it's a good quote for life. And another thing he said, he was talking about how they don't give any how-tos, and they don't distribute any material that could be used as how-tos as part of his Semco style of companies and management. And he's written 2 books, but I'm guessing they're sort of story format and they're not step 1 do this, step 2 do this. And he said something really funny. He said, we don't give out any information in any format that could be useful to anyone. And I was thinking about that in terms of how in a previous video I was talking about making summary videos with the key points. And in a way that would be like trying to make something useful for somebody. And this whole time I've just been talking and it's not really to be useful. It's just talking. And so when I heard him say that, and I like his style, I thought to myself, maybe I won't make a summary video, because that would be, in a way, an attempt to make something more condensed and useful. And all of this talking is pretty much useless. There's no how-tos, and I've talked about that before, that I'm not saying this is how to do anything. And I was also saying I find it difficult to put things into some kind of structure of some sort, and partly that's because of my memory. I just forget. And this makes it easy to remember that, oh, I just have one notebook and I make a couple notes in it and I open it up and I start talking. And that's all I have to remember for the most part. And the rest of my life is whatever I see in front of me, and that's it. So yeah, maybe no summary videos, though I could watch or listen in order to extrapolate things, but maybe not. And I was also thinking that it would be good to go back, because I sort of want to know what I said so I can do some of what I said. And another way would just be to share all these videos and then wait for people to tell me what I said, if people ask. So realize and remember things that I said through what people talk to me about, because I'm assuming that I'll get a few conversations started, maybe not many. Doesn't matter. Again, this isn't about how-to, this isn't about useful stuff. This is just about seeing and communicating with oneself in a different way. And he also said recently that he celebrated 10 years without making a single decision as part of the company. And I think that's really cool. And I think if I share these videos, maybe people might pick up on little bits, and that would just create some dialogue organically, and then I don't have to decide what to do with the videos. Just the sharing will be the doing and tell me where to go with it. Stuff needs to be done. We each have a piece of the puzzle. Maybe there's some kind of peer puzzle. And what's your piece of the puzzle? What's your gift? And he also said, don't make a decision and a solution will come up that's not your solution alone. And again, a decision is thinking. It's sort of saying, should I do this or should I do that? And when we're not doing that and the mind's quiet, something else arises in consciousness. And it's not the ego deciding. So it's similar to what I see with perception. And so I really like his style and his principles. They're really out there. And I think if we ever do have some kind of sharing as peers, it needs to be out there and organic like that. And oddly enough, I was on the Emerging Proud blog, and at the bottom, somebody had written a blurb about teal organizations. And I only read about that in that document by Leading Wise, and then lo and behold, it was on the Emerging Proud blog. So it is definitely something, this whole concept of teal. I think it's something to do with spiral dynamics as well. And again, it's what is evolution, or what is the world or the universe asking of us? And it seems that the world is asking me to talk to myself on video, because I am, and I have about 170 videos, varying in length from 3 minutes to an hour and 10 minutes. And it's just about planting seeds, and these are seeds of consciousness. Words are seeds of consciousness. If they hit the clear mind and paint a picture or have some sort of impact or impression that creates the space to see that which the other is talking about. And he mentioned how business models, current business models, are anachronistic, which means something like out of place in time. And I feel like the mental health system is anachronistic. And I feel like the more that we can dialogue in this way that is more congruent with how we see and feel and experience things, then that anachronistic part will have less space in our lives. And it seems that I keep coming back to this light coming out of the eyes thing. And I wrote that the way we look at someone, the light coming out of our eye, is electrical nutrition. How we look at someone is what determines what we say. So what we project onto that person, how we look at them, is what determines what we say to that person. So if a doctor's looking at somebody with pathology eyes, they're going to say something to them in terms of pathologizing them, or labeling them, or speaking to them with that role. And that soundscape creates the soundscape of the other, so it creates the response of the other. So the light of our eyes and how we look determines the soundscape that we project, and then that soundscape from the light of their eyes is what creates the soundscape of response, or the action of response. But whoever it is who's looking at someone might not have to even say anything. The other person, if they're sensitive, can read that energy, and it's probably from the aura as well as the light coming out of one's eyes. You think of holograms, and if somebody's thinking something and projecting images of that person, or judgments, or measures and evaluations, it could be holographically coming out of their eyes, even in terms of an interference pattern. And the other person can actually see that and read that, especially when a person is in crisis, because they're very sensitive to things like energy. And this light in the eye phenomenon could also be how people will randomly come up to us and start talking to us about something or bring us a message. They can read that. And that could be something to do with synchronicity. It could be synchronizing something about the eyes. And that's the thing, when a person is in that clear space, one can just look in the eyes and come up and give a message or give something based on the emptiness, because when one's empty like that, one can receive, whether it's the light in someone else's eyes or they actually coming up and saying something or helping with something. It hasn't happened so much lately, probably because of working in the mental health system, but before I would often have experiences of people being extra kind and helpful and talking to me and things like that. And we highlight things with what we say. We create that as light with the sound images in our minds. Sound is creative. First there was the word. And sound creates matter by saying what's the matter. And we can speak lightness. Words can bring humor and lightness. And I do feel I need to get back to that humor space, and maybe one day I'll have talked enough about this where I can just get back to that space of laughter and lightness. And I had an insight that the brain grows with new sound. And when we have all these old sounds spinning in our heads and there's no space in between them, it blocks new light from coming in and creating new sound. And that sound is blocking the new light. And whenever we have those moments where we actually see something beautiful and our mind is quiet, because the mind is quiet, we experience awe. Like, wow, that's so beautiful, and we're speechless. But it doesn't happen very often because it's always talking about old stuff, and old stuff isn't awe. So I was thinking about how awe is actually just a concept. It's something we experience because most of the time we're just babbling on about old stuff. But if that babbling wasn't happening and we were always perceiving, there would be no awe. Awe is a product of a noisy, egoic mind, just like the concept of flow. These concepts of these modes of consciousness that we're just barely able to get into, and we make them into these huge things because we can rarely get into them. And the opposite is kind of true with what I'm talking about with managing one's own crisis, one's own psychosis, one's own PTSD flashbacks. It's super intense. And we make it into this big deal, like mental illness and this huge system around it, when if we could manage that state and minimize it, just like somebody might go into flow for 2 days and be like, wow, that was so great. Somebody can go into psychosis for 2 days and be like, wow, that was so bad, and then just be done with it. They're just different states of consciousness that we spend less time in because we're usually in the ego mode of consciousness. And then we turn these very powerful bad ones, supposedly bad, into this extreme system of hoopla. And then there's people trying to get into flow on the other side, which is the other side of the same coin. I see beauty all the time everywhere, and it doesn't feel like awe, because if you can see, it's everywhere all the time. It's not this one flash and then thinking, how do I get that back? the thought, how do I get that back, is what blinds us from seeing what's right there in front of us.